Welcome. I'm Ben Friedman. I'm the policy director at Defense Priorities. We're talking today about ongoing issues in cybersecurity and a new book by Jon Lindsay, uh, The Age of Deception, Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft. We have three speakers to discuss these issues. I'll introduce them in the order they'll be speaking. Jon Lindsay is an associate professor at the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He's the author of The Age of Deception, Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft, the book we're talking about, as well as a bunch of other books. He's been doing great work recently on deterrence. He was the co-author of a book that came out last year, Elements of Deterrence, Strategy, Technology and Complexity in Global Politics, with Eric Gartsky. And John earned his PhD at MIT. He also served in the US Navy. Secondly, we have Carole, who is now the CEO at Penumbra Strategies. She is the former White House National Security Council Special Advisor for Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Policy. She led efforts on a major executive order that came out late last year or early this year. Before serving in the National Security Council, she worked at Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And prior to that, she worked at the Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, where she did cybersecurity work. And she was an Army officer. Carole has a master's from Georgetown. Thirdly, we have Allan Friedman, who this summer completed a decade, more or less, of service in the U.S. government doing cybersecurity. Most recently, he was at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, where he led efforts to promote the use of software bills of material. Prior to that, he was director of cybersecurity initiatives at the Department of Commerce. And before that, he was an academic at GW and worked at Brookings. He's the co-author, along with Peter Singer, of Cybersecurity and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know, which came out a few years ago. With that, we can get started. I've asked each of the panelists to give a 5 to 7 minute opening set of remarks in response to a question before we get to general discussion. And the question is the U.S. government focused on the right cyber threats? And if not, how do we shift focus so it is correct? So, Jon, you're up first.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks a lot for putting this together. It's really a pleasure to be with this set of panelists. So I think I'll start with the first part of that question. Are we looking at the right kinds of threats? The title of this book is Cybersecurity as Secret Statecraft. It's not cybersecurity as a new form of warfare, or cybersecurity as an existential threat to critical infrastructure. It's cybersecurity as secret statecraft. And so the overall argument of the book is it is helpful to think about cyber conflict, cyber exploitation in terms of classic forms of espionage, sabotage, subversion, and counterintelligence. And these are forms of politics that have been around for hundreds, actually thousands of years. But we probably haven't studied them and theorized them in the discipline of security studies. And that's understandable. We've been very interested in peace and war, and throughout most of the 20th century in deterrence, because dealing with this other technological revolution in nuclear weaponry was really, really paramount. And so we focused on using large-scale military weapons, not to fight wars, but to avoid them. So theories of deterrence came to the fore. And the theme of the book is that the reason that we are seeing such an uptick over the past couple of decades in cyber conflict, cyber espionage, hacking behavior, is that we have really, really robust information systems that allow us to communicate and coordinate and engage in global commerce at an unprecedented scale. Simply put, it enables human beings to cooperate. And the irony is that when we are able to cooperate at scale, we are also able to deceive each other, because to break trust, you have to have trust in the first place. So the argument of the book is that when we look at all of this cyber activity, it's tempting to think that, well, because the technology is new, this activity must be new, and we need to come up with new ways of theorizing this style of war. And the argument is that because it's actually this old form, we need to come up with theories for this that we haven't had to do because it hasn't been in our face in the same way that it is when we've got large-scale cooperative infrastructure enabling this large-scale espionage and subversive behavior. So that's what the book tries to do: is take a step back from the technology and really theorize and understand the underlying political dynamics of deception. Which I argue are really, really different than warfare or deterrence. And, we can talk about that a little bit more. And that said, I think that it means that the U.S. government's approach to cyber threats needs to be grounded in understanding, number one, that this is a form of deception at scale, and number two, that it's predicated on the stability of collective institutions and infrastructure. So maintaining the health of those infrastructures is really, really important. And then number two, countering that deception with the tools of intelligence rather than the tools of warfare is going to be really important. So I think I'll pause there. Just summarize kind of the contributions of the book as I see them are: number one, talking about this concept of secret statecraft in general in any era. Could be 2,000 years ago, could be today, and thinking about this as the use of organized deception for strategic advantage. Number two, dropping from the strategic down to the operational level and thinking about what it takes to actually be successful in this world, how you actually exploit institutions and what kinds of organizational resources you need. And then number three, applying these general concepts to the realm of cybersecurity, which is where we have secret statecraft, but more digitized, supersized, civilianized, and potentially weaponized. Back over to you, Ben.
Okay, Carole, you're up next.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. And what a great framing to follow after this. I'd say from my lens, which I know is colored very much by where I've served. And I know we've all heard that adage that where you stand depends on where you sit. So I know coming at the concepts of cyber warfare and strategic deterrence are definitely impacted by my service previously as a chem bio rad nuclear defense officer in the U.S. Army, as well as studying things like operational art and Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and all these frames of reference that so many brilliant people, including Dr. Lindsay, have been looking at for a long time, and really looking forward to Allan's comments as well. But really when we think about what we've been preparing for, especially in the U.S. government, and when I joined the National Security Council in 2021, when I came aboard for my first tour, I will say that we had a bit of this, facing this challenge where the US government had been very focused on a whodunit and focusing on nation state actors kind of approach, which is really critical, especially when thinking about the concepts of cyber warfare. But since you asked us this question of, are we focused on the right cyber threats? I think it was critically important for us to, instead of thinking primarily about who done it and like which state actors and adversaries are responsible for the action, instead in the cyber world, needing to think about what the impact, in fact, was of it. And this is critically important where nation states and non-state actors, especially where asymmetric threats can pose a really significant impact in this domain. And in the rise of ransomware, which was happening really massively, especially in 2021, and literally within the first 6 to 8 weeks of me being at the NSC was when we faced the Colonial Pipeline incident. This was critical to help bring to the forefront that things like cybercrime that were previously looked at by certain parts of the national security apparatus as primarily a law enforcement issue were actually were actually worthy of being considered and elevated to a national security threat, because their ability to take down critical infrastructure was not predicated by its operation as a state actor. Now, of course, there's strategic context around permissive states or even state sponsors behind some of these illicit actors that very much are important to think about, especially when we think about what the interplay is between state and non-state actors and thinking about strategic deterrence. But basically, this sort of highlights how the cyber domain, where you have criminal actors being able to achieve state level consequences, does bring to bear some of the unique tensions in our ability to be able to go after and dismantle these networks, and also changes some of the calculus for us in thinking about how to defend against them. Of course, as a former Treasury person, I have to highlight that I do think that most cybercrime is financial crime, recognizing that while that isn't the main purpose and point of where Dr. Lindsay was focusing, especially on cyber operations as a form of statecraft, like massive amount of cybercrime that we're looking at really is financial crime, in the sense that it's either conducting espionage or recon in order to gain information that can be monetized down the road. I do think that even stealing of intellectual property is a form of economic warfare and plays into that as a nature of financial and economic crime as well, more broadly. Or they're deliberately like trying to hack to steal funds, like we're seeing with North Korean targeting of the cryptocurrency sector for billions at a time inside of their hacks. So there's been a transition that the U.S. government has prioritized and elevated these as national security priorities, that I think is good news. And that needs to be accounted for. But whether we're thinking about it through the right lens, like Dr. Lindsay framed, I think is really critically important, because unfortunately in the world of cyber, we're in this phase where we're seeing kind of a death by 1,000 cuts, right? And some of this is based on the nature of the way that cyber warfare is conducted, right? Where many of the terrain that's being leveraged is often commercial, right? The targets are often commercial and critical infrastructure. So this private-public dynamic between responsible entities and who the targets are, and especially when we think about the physical domain, like I didn't have to spend a dime on setting up a THAAD system in my backyard to defend against Iranian missile strikes, right? Like in the physical domain, we don't expect Americans and businesses to defend themselves against state actors. We do in the cyber domain. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, including scalability, the challenges that would come from the US government operating and being on critical infrastructure, like infrastructure and networks all the time. Like that presents massive privacy concerns, as well as just state control, like what the taxes would be for that, for the government to be that large and its capability. There's huge issues around resources and rights, and what is the best way to be able to defend against these digitized, highly interconnected and interdependent networks, when you have this really fragmented defense. Also, that I wrote a piece recently comparing how we should be thinking about defending against things like potential Iranian cybercrime rising, especially in the wake of the recent standoff that we had. Thinking about it from the lessons that we learned from ancient Greece and from the Delian League, seeing a really fragmented like city-state approach that only unified later when we recognized that we needed to not have a transition away from national coordination of cybersecurity, which is currently what's happening, but instead focusing on that greater coordination and unifying of defenses and leveraging things like terrain advantages and choke points. I think all of those lessons are necessary and part of the transition that, Ben, as you asked for us to think about how we do this shift. I think it really demands us looking at some of the lessons that we've learned, where there's similarities and corollaries from prior traditional warfare, but also where there's some unique aspects of the domain, being both the terrain upon which the competition is being held and the kinds of weapons or tools that we're able to use. There are some things that are pretty unique in the cyber world that I know we'll be getting into for the rest of this. So I'll close with highlighting that I was calling for a digital phalanx, and that kind of approach on integrated defense posture with really like coordinated and opportunistic but very deliberate offensive capabilities is necessary for that, for a more cohesive deterrent as well as defensive apparatus.
Yeah, we'll get into that more, certainly. Allan, you're up.
Thanks. First, it was great to sort of engage with Jon's book on sort of the spy versus spy approach. Hopefully that's not disparaging. And I want to sort of drill down a little bit into sort of the private sector role here, as that's my area of expertise, both as sort of a organizational behavior person and an economist, as well as a technologist, is who's in a position to do what and where is the technology capable. So Jon's book spends some time talking about the role of counterintelligence, right? If this is something where we've primarily the secret agencies doing activities, there is an established role for counterintelligence. And where do and do we not see this? So when Congress held hearings for the 2015 breach of the Office of Personnel Management Records, right, one of the biggest successes of the PRC in targeting American intelligence officials and American officials with clearance, because it was all of the background data of everyone who was cleared for top secret applications under OPM. They had representatives who came from the agencies who were in charge of defending these civilian agencies, but they did not actually have public discussions with our counterintelligence services to say, hey, why wasn't this part of it? Right. So at that stage, initially we said, hey, defending this kind of secret data was seen as still a civilian responsibility, not a counterintelligence responsibility. So that's one big piece, which is just aligning the efforts, because the targets for intelligence activities are going to be civilian agencies who don't have an intelligence remit, and, as Carole alluded to, private sector organizations that are often playing a key role in the intelligence community. Now, some of that we understand is fair game, right? We know that there's public records of the United States, particularly going after or sanctioning private sector actors in China and in Russia, saying, hey, you're doing things that are intelligence gathering and we're going to publicly sanction you. But from a defensive perspective, it's a little bit harder. Carole mentioned, right, who's going to pay for those activities? And I'm sure we'll get into a little more detail around that, especially as we deal with critical infrastructure. Right? We know that even as we are in the sort of intelligence and spy versus spy approach, in the domain of conflict, there is still the risk of direct and targeted attack against critical infrastructure. We're talking about the power grid, we're talking about water, we're talking about the communications network, such as recent targets of the various Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon. Now, this is where we have this horrible blurry line, which is, hey, if I'm going into the telecommunications sector and taking over systems, am I doing it so that I can listen in and eavesdrop intelligence activity, or engage in, pre-prepare to shut down those networks, which would be much more of a cyber network operation or an active engagement? And this is something where it is hard to draw that line of what's going on. As we're recording this talk, the Chinese government has come out and said, hey, someone targeted our network time infrastructure, something that is used by all of critical infrastructure to maintain timing, which is a critical part of all information systems, so that everyone sort of can communicate effectively together. Now, China has done their attribution of saying that was a particular American intelligence agency. I highlight that not to say it was or it was not the US, but to say we've got this challenge of attribution where organizations may choose to come forward and say, this was it, this was who hit this, and this is civilian. And now we're seeing back and forth of, when do we say this is civilian and when do we not? We're now at a phase in this conflict where the intelligence communities and the counterintelligence communities are each accusing the other of saying, you are going after our critical infrastructure as battlefield prep rather than intelligence. I don't know if we have a clean way at the policy level or even at the theoretical level of drawing that line of who can attack, of where those boundaries are crossed.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, it does seem like a key line because it sort of moves the activity we're worrying about from being an intelligence issue to a military issue and back and forth. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. It seems to me that cybersecurity is a sort of an impossibly broad category in that it includes a lot of crime, some of which is sort of the equivalent of what a local police force would deal with, all the way up to potentially high-end sort of military-style attacks with lots of espionage and propaganda in the middle. So I wonder, as a question, how much are we losing by, or what's the cost of lumping this all together? And is it sort of when you're in the inside, is it much more I don't know, understandable and sensible where these lines are, where okay, at the White House we're dealing with managing espionage and these sort of warfare issues, or are we kind of in a situation where, as if we have like local police departments, uh, intelligence agencies, and military commanders all kind of mixing together and confusing each other?
Sure, I guess I'll jump in on that. I think Carole's point about colonial and how that highlighted the way in which a financially motivated criminal attack can have these massive spillover implications for critical infrastructure. And you imagine something like that happen during a crisis or a conflict, and the confusion which that would create, even if it was just a criminal gang doing it, and it wasn't, okay, we're in a conflict with Russia or China. You're of course going to be wondering if this is preparatory to something else. So you're absolutely right. I mean, not only are those lines grayed, I mean, this gray zone becomes really, really large. This is one of these classic wicked problems, wicked in the sense of very complex and dynamic and lots of actors and variables feeding in at the same time. And that's true of every public policy problem, but I think it's especially true of the realm of secret statecraft because it is designed to subvert institutional distinctions. And when you make clear distinctions between the international and the domestic, or law enforcement and intelligence or military, that means there is a seam in your government response. And that's going to be an interesting seam for an adversary to subvert. Whether they're motivated by politics or finance is another question. When you look at the history of, spy versus spy intelligence interactions, interactions with the criminal underworld has always been important. You've always needed forgers. You've always needed, counterfeit money. You've always needed to launder the funds that you're using to pay agents. But it is being able to do crime at scale, which is also abetting your ability to mobilize those same criminal networks for nation state purposes. And we see this very, very explicitly in the way, the Russians conduct their cyber operations, and increasingly, in China as well. The Chinese MSS, which is the kind of Chinese KGB, they have increasingly been leveraging a lot of hack for hire operations, which gives them a cutout, right? But these then are also, businesses that may be mainly in business with the Chinese state, but they're also doing business in other places. And the Chinese state is willing to ignore that as long as it doesn't come back to bite Beijing. So this growing gray zone, I think, creates a lot of opportunity for threat actors and counterintelligence actors. I mean, let's be clear about that as well. But I think I just want to say that, like, when we say let's clarify these distinctions, that's kind of a fundamental part of the strategic dynamic that we're trying to tussle with here. So I'm kind of happy that I get to be an academic and just describe these problems, and then Alan and Carole actually have to figure out smart ways to solve them.
Yeah, I love like the way that you framed that, especially right at the end about that the clarity that we do wish and that we want, like, is so intangible and really hard for us to wrap our arms around for a lot of very good reasons, including that, like, that even the government, like the efficiencies that you get from autocracies, I feel, that that are reinforced by digitization. Like there's a lot of inefficiencies that we build into democracies, and a lot of those create things like, for example, due process takes a long time. So when I think about a lot of the actions that we've been taking to try to dismantle cyber criminal networks, so entities that were not state actors, but even if they're state sponsored, state supported, state permitted, and that does describe so many of these entities, because so many there are many states where a lot of these actors operate from, and are not putting in place the critical protections and defensive measures that are like required to be put in place, like as we agreed to under the Cybercrime Convention. And this points to where like we're trying to apply norms and expectations, then taking lessons that we've learned in other domains. Even I think about encountering illicit finance. We learned this lesson in the 90s that terrorism financing in your jurisdiction will fund terrorism in mine. So we created the FATF, the International Standards Org, or the UN for Anti-Money Laundering. And we have standards of expectation across states. We have evaluation mechanisms. We have countermeasures that get put in place. We've not quite learned those lessons to the same extent, but we do have things like this treaty, this convention that we've agreed to at the UN level of expectations of state behavior, and we were negotiating that painstakingly, including some expectations that jurisdictions do not create a permissive environment for these criminal organizations to operate from within them. But of course, like implementation is it's very challenging. It's very real. It drives a scalpel into the heart of this exact issue that we're talking about now, this problem, especially when we think about trying to transfer things like concepts of deterrence and how we would conduct warfare against non-state organizations, whether it's crime groups. I think asymmetric lenses are often very helpful, I think, although like I will always use an excuse to apply a Clausewitzian lens anywhere because I'm a good old Army officer. But when you think about what the nature of the organization is that's driving that policy, or what the actors are that are actually conducting the execution and operating in the realm of uncertainty, like would normally be the military, but are instead these like the specific cyber actors are. And then what is the passion or the intent or the voice of the people, like that the trinity that the Clausewitzian's trinity about how you need to think about the lens of warfare and what's needed. It's tough when you start applying that to non-state actors, or it just demands a rethinking about like understanding what are the motivations and the intentions, what are the tools that are going to be capable. And it's really tough in a domain where we have a lot of operational uncertainty and attribution that can be ambiguous at times. And then also even where the concept of what is cyber warfare or cyber operations bleeds, especially with our adversaries, a lot into the nature of information warfare. Like these rails is not the geographic terrain upon which we operate, but it's the digital terrain that we now are operating so much of our commerce, so much of our information gathering and discussions globally. And our adversaries have integrated things like information warfare and control and information ops into cyber doctrine in a really comprehensive kind of way, and in a way that we don't necessarily think about it in that same way, especially because I don't think democracies view the idea of wanting to control information. We think that generally access to information is a good thing, and that will lead towards greater democratization and the reflecting of the kinds of principles that we want in society. That gets really tough now when we're now integrating something that is very much the domain of the state, which is physical warfare, into now like on terrain and across rails and levers that in democracies we feel are very much the domain of like private society and things that we don't want to be controlled by the state. So I think anyway, I just highlighting some of the greater challenges that we have in trying to apply some of those same frames of reference, depending on which nature or aspect of cyber warfare and competition that we're talking about.
So I've got a history point, a technology point, and a sort of applied policy point. So on the history side, I'm chuckling because last time I spent time thinking about cybersecurity with Jon Lindsay. Both of us are grad students, and this is when IR was first beginning to have the first round of conversations about cybersecurity. And someone that I had the privilege of working with, Joe Nye, leader of sort of a lot of IR, was proposing the idea of, hey, this would be a lot simpler if we could just drain the swamp of cybercrime. And so let's have a concerted national security driven effort to get rid of cybercrime, and that will expose the stuff that we care about, which is the intelligence and the warfare side of things. And of course, that 15 years, 20 years later looks delightfully naive, but it's a fun way that this idea has been around for a while. On the technical side, what's quite interesting is the interplay between the criminal side and the national security side. We see vulnerabilities that were first pioneered by national actors very quickly being spilled over and exploited for criminal gains. And one of the truisms of cybersecurity is the window between sophisticated exploitation and widespread exploitation has been shrinking over time. The traditional solution has been, we need more information sharing, we need more transparency. Spent a lot of my career advocating for things like that, but we're now at a level where it's less human scale transparency and more we need machine scale transparency through things like one of my pet topics, software bill of materials and approaches like that. And the last piece is, and by the way, it also goes the other way, where we've seen a very sophisticated country like North Korea. We now talk about North Korea being a sophisticated actor, which even 5 years ago, we all would have giggled to say North Korea is a sophisticated actor in the cyber domain. They learned where the value was. It was in crime, but it's actually quite terrifying, which is they really devoted a lot of time and energy to figure out exactly how to exploit these modern systems. And those tools could just as easily be applied against modern private sector systems. And then the last piece is on the nature of sort of pointing to this is what the exploit is. And this is a long debate that we've had in the private side of, should I point to weaknesses, right? In the vulnerability space for the, from 2000 or even the 90s up to about 2015, it was a real debate. Should I point out when your system has flaws, and how should I do it? And that's largely resolved into globally accepted concepts of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. But that doesn't work in the past tense as much in the intelligence space. Going back to Jon's spy versus spy framing, I'm giving up very valuable very valuable ground from an intelligence perspective if I tell anyone what an adversary did to me, even sharing it across, say, inside the government, but across the intelligence civilian boundary. Because at CISA, we had an obligation to defend American critical infrastructure. And so the secret squirrels, right, couldn't in all good faith tell the civilian defenders certain things because that might tip off the attackers that the defenders knew what was going on. And this is, private. This is called intelligence equities. And early on in my career, I came across the concept that defenders and the listeners have been fighting about this turf going all the way back to the days of Enigma. And the defenders are still waiting to win one round, right? The intelligence community is structured to say prioritize future collection rather than immediate defense.
Thanks. Yeah, on that, or related to that point, I do think it would be good to talk a little bit about tactics in cybersecurity, and specifically something you write about, Jon, which is how deterrence works or doesn't work in this sphere. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see deterrence in at least some aspects of cybersecurity as different than in other realms, and Carole and Allan can react and maybe bring to bear their experience, and to what extent are you even thinking about deterrence as part of your job, or is it just kind of a secondary thing?
Great. I will take the question of deterrence, and I want to try and also work in a few reactions to what Allan was just saying, which I really find super, super interesting. I mean, this whole idea of we're going to drain the swamp of cybercrime, right, raises this basic kind of economic public policy question of what's the optimal amount of crime? It's not zero, right? You need some of it. I mean, if you put all of your resources in crime, like we're not going to have resources left to do anything out, and that's not going to be a society you want to live in. So there's lots of reasons why it's not zero. In fact, there's some positive things that you get from having a little bit of flexibility to deal with the inherent contradictions that exist across jurisdictions or even within jurisdictions. There's a whole, kind of subversive literature on what's the optimum amount of corruption inside of a government. It's also not zero because you need some side deals to happen, even to get good policies through. So, it suggests that there's always going to be this penumbra of shady stuff that goes on in the international system. And you just want to figure out what's the right amount of it to have. So this is kind of where I would link it to deterrence, right? This is where deterrence in cyber is so different than deterrence in the nuclear realm, right? How many nuclear wars are enough? Like zero is the right answer. Deterrence must not fail. And in cyber, it's much more like, okay, what's the bound of behavior that we're going to tolerate? And even being aware that whatever we set, there's still going to be, gray areas on that gray boundary. So deterrence is less about just stopping something from happening altogether and more about shaping ongoing behavior. And that means that if you're shaping, you're probably going to be involved in a more operational way. Again, this is not the way that we traditionally thought about deterrence. Although I will add that even in the Cold War, there's what strategists thought about deterrence, and then there's how deterrence actually worked. And in practice, the implementation of force postures was an ongoing process, and there was lots of operations that were happening, and deterrence was pushing conflict into lower levels and peripheral levels. So the very, very clean idea that we have of like, once you have mutually assured destruction with secure second strike forces, nothing happens, that was never quite true. But it's kind of true. It's true enough, right, that we can tell this story about nuclear weapons, but we can't tell it with cyber. So let me get in on kind of like the key point that I just really want to emphasize is that the logic of deterrence is fundamentally a logic of transparency. I need to clearly and credibly communicate to you what the costs or risks are going to be if you cross some line. And if I'm doing coercion, then it's the opposite thing. I'm going to clearly communicate to you the punishment that, if you don't eat your vegetables or whatever it's going to be. Okay. And the cyber world, the espionage world, is dominated by the logic of deception. And the logic of deception is I'm going to pretend to cooperate overtly while I'm doing a little extra on the side. There's some uncontrolled degrees of freedom in the institutions or infrastructures, and I'm going to use those to either suck data out or push some instructions in. So I am going out of my way to hide activity, the capabilities, the agency of who's responsible. And this is really at odds with deterrence. In fact, in deterrence theory, much of what goes for cyber and espionage, we would just call that bluffing, right? We would call that, asymmetric information. All of these are words that are bad for deterrence, that lead to bargaining failure. So I think there is this kind of fundamental mismatch between the logic of the domains. Okay, so that's why I was very, very worried back in in Allan and I were having these conversations with Joe Nye about, tailoring deterrence ideas for cyber. And it kind of just didn't make sense for these reasons, right? You go into cyber not because you're worried about having a war. In fact, you're often trying to avoid it, and you're working around deterrence. You're working around constraints. You're subverting those constraints. So that's why you need this kind of different political logic. That said, I do think the place where deterrence does matter at a very, Ben, you asked about kind of tactics, right? Any tactical intelligence agent or cyber operations person, right? They are deterred by the possibility of losing their access, of losing their exploits, of having their tooling burned down. Maybe they've got some additional resources and not deterred very much. But if you're operating in secret, you need to keep those things secret. So there is kind of an operational deterrent that keeps things right at a certain level and encourages more, sophisticated and I would say restrained ways of ongoing exploitation.
So I think that's I appreciate that framing, and I see so much of that being true, especially when thinking about the strategic nuclear deterrent framing. But I am curious, and I appreciate that the latter part of your remarks really highlighted that it's not that we should be forsaking thinking about deterrence and trying to deter them from acting. Like there's other framings than just mutually assured destruction and deterrence around by denial of effects, denial of terrain, as well as imposing of consequences. And I know that you just spoke to all of that. So I do think that I love how you outlined and articulated some of the specifics around this challenge of, as you mentioned, like a really clear transparency in communication and like auditable, provable, credible framing that is necessary for things like our nuclear deterrence frameworks and what they've been built upon, and the challenges that comes with that, when frankly even just the ambiguity that we have where we don't even understand what the cascading consequences can be sometimes of some of certain cyber actions and effects that can occur. It's funny. It reminds me of things like biological warfare. When I was a CBRN officer, biological was always the one where you're like, your ability to control that and model it was like so much less than looking at than all the other letters of CBRN. It was just a lot easier to model and to feel really good predictably about your ability to control the release of something versus biological agents. So from a defensive perspective, which is what CBRN officers are in the Army, it was like biological was always one that really scared me and worried me about that. And so I see this on some of this issue of predictability that you don't have in the cyber domain. I am wondering to what extent some of the greater forward leaps that we are making with, I know I'll say AI, I know buzzword hit, with the increases in AI, as well as with quantum computing and other things, with these continued advances that we end up having that may end up helping to answer our questions, at least on things like predictability and understanding of our network mapping and what the predictable consequences are, to what extent that aspect of the deterrence framework may get answered. I'm curious how you think that doesn't solve the issue that you mentioned of that we don't have the incentive of wanting to disclose it. Even if we can understand what the consequences are of our actions, we may not want the piece where we're disclosing our capability of being able to achieve those impacts because of what that would mean for forsaking on the intelligence gathering side. So I think that's really apt. But I did just want to I wanted to highlight that, where I feel like there's still elements of deterrence, and ultimately the challenge that we've had with keeping it in the cybercrime bucket is that if you look at how many years it takes for us to bring these cases, and when it's done under a primary or exclusive law enforcement hat, isn't working, right? Like that's why we stood up the counter ransomware campaign, to sequence and bring together a sustained pressure campaign of lots of different coordinated disruption that means denying of financial rails that they're leveraging for laundering their assets, as well as the technological infrastructure and platforms that they're using. Even if those have less enduring impacts than law enforcement, they can be more sustained and near-term actions that occur. So I think thinking about what tools then are best shaped and honed for us to achieve the deterrent impact that we want is going to be critical. Sorry, Allan.
Oh no! First, you win today's AI bingo race. First mentioned AI in 2025. So two very quick comments. One, which is deterrence through other mechanisms. Right, deterrence has always been multi-domain. Right. There's certain aggression in Eastern Europe. We decide to not go to a particular summit or withdraw from the Olympics, right? It's always been multi-domain. And in the cyber domain, great, you're engaged in certain behavior we don't like. Guess what? You're never going on in Russia, you're never going on vacation to Thailand again. right? All your vacations are going to be on the sunny Crimea. So we've always been able to do it in this space. The second is a term that I never liked when I was wearing my theory hat, which is deterrence by denial. But I think it does come down to minimizing impact and saying, well, yes, I'll be able to knock down this system, but it won't have the follow-on effect. It will minimize the blast radius, and we can do that through investment in technology and policy, and dare I say it in this format, regulation to drive those two things. And I think also we can see that in other domains. So this is an area where if I can minimize cyber impact, it actually acts as a deterrence in very real national conflict. And of course, as we look towards activities by the PRC, often thrown around, coming up very soon in 2027, a lot of our modeling assumptions around Chinese activity in the South China Sea involves a very rapid disabling of American capabilities, both in terms of our national security forces, right, blind Pacific Command, and also just disrupt critical infrastructure. So that is our leadership's attention dealing with things at home. Being able to limit that impact changes adversary calculus as they try to say, can we get away with this aggressive strike that would otherwise go against American interests?
Why don't you like deterrence by denial? I really like it.
It was, for me, deterrence fit into a very clean game theory mathematical bucket. And deterrence by denial does change game theory, but it changes it in a way that usually other parts of game theory didn't use that term as deterrence.
I got you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it collapses into
it makes the game boring.
Yeah, can I jump back in there? I agree with you completely, right? I mean, like
both.
Like the deterrence by punishment, you do this, I will do that somewhere else. That's intuitive. That makes sense. You're going to talk about like law enforcement actions afterwards. We get deterrence by punishment. We had to put denial in there because it was obviously relevant in military affairs. And I would say increasingly relevant, right? So, I mean, when you have command of the sky, right, that means that your ground forces cannot mass fires the way they would like to. That would be their best thing. So now they have to disperse. They're going to be less effective. That means that there's less things for the air guys to shoot at. So nothing's happening. So you're doing deterrence, but it's this very operational thing in order to shape what's going on in the domain. So it definitely starts to mess things up because it like denial is inherently blurring the range between, pure punishment and kind of pure warfighting operations where you're not communicating at all. Right. In the pure Clausewitzian duel, there is no communication, and deterrence is over on the other extreme. Ben mentioned that other book, Elements of Deterrence. And one of the big goals of that book was to point out that there are multiple goals going on in any deterrence strategy. I mean, the United States loves deterrence, right? We think that it was this magic thing in the Cold War. Let's get some of that, deterrence dust today to solve our big problems. But when you say deterrence, you mean I don't want to have a war. Okay, that's probably true, but you could do that with appeasement. So we don't really mean that, right? We still want some influence over the status quo, which means you're going to accept some risk. But let's not just have influence over the status quo. Maybe let's improve it and make it a little bit better, okay? We would like people to give us what we want, but without a fight. Okay, but if we have to fight, we want to have the military power to do so, maybe by denial. But what if our military power depends on maneuver and secrecy and things that you can't communicate, you can't credibly commit to have in one place? That means you have a warfighting advantage, which you can no longer use to communicate, but you still need that power, right? But maybe you don't want to spend a lot on this because you've got other kind of guns versus butter trade-offs and guns versus guns trade-offs that you want to spend in other places. So when you say, I want to deter someone, it's like, I want you to give me what I want without a fight, at low cost, and I want to win the war when it happens. And those are four great goals, but you can't often have them all at the same time. And I would say that cyber is way on the efficiency side. Usually you're like, I want to do some cyber because I want to improve efficiency. either in the pro cyber role for improving your command and control communications and your business operations, or on the other side where I want to erode your ability to do this. So that's the cost part of deterrence, but you've got all of these other things that are going on. So I agree. I think we have stretched the concept of deterrence way too much, and it would be more, I think, helpful when we're doing kind of defense policy analysis if we're just clear about which goal of deterrence we want, and then how our ways and means are going to link to those different goals. We'd be better off.
Yeah, so you're a skeptic of integrated deterrence, is that correct, John?
Very much so. Yes, I think
we can't
deterrence
just
is non-integratable
hegemon
across
and
the
go
main
from
level.
there.
Say again?
Can't just assume hegemon and go from there.
Well, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The Trump administration says they want to achieve cyber dominance. I don't know what that. And they also want to achieve, as a side, energy dominance. So I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that, but I would think it has something to do with going on offense. So, and Carole, you mentioned this a little bit. Maybe we could just talk briefly about the offense-defense balance, which is a concept from international relations where, depending on the type of weapon, there's an idea that the offensive side of warfare has an advantage over the defender, or vice versa in a defense-dominant world. Is there an offense-defense balance in cyber, and is offense dominant? Do we need to make offense dominant? I don't know if maybe John, you can start, and then we'll go around the horn.
Okay. So offense defense theory was IR's attempt to talk about technology in the 80s, and this idea kind of fell apart, but it keeps coming back to us every time we have to talk about a new offense defense balance. So we're already hearing the AI offense defense balance story, so that's coming up. And I think, just to grossly summarize kind of this vast arc of criticism, the idea is that the offense-defense balance does not hold at the systemic level. You can't just say this technology is offense or defense dominant. You have to say, looking at these two actors in this particular situation, there may be offensive and defensive advantages, because you have to take into account their doctrine, their organization, their style of government, their civil-military relations, all of these different things, which will then create these local or dyadic, offense-defense advantages. And in the cyber realm, right, it's just really complicated, I would argue, because you're fundamentally looking at how different institutions, these secrecy specialists like, intelligence agencies or criminal networks or counterintelligence units or, civilian threat intelligence firms are contesting this space. So they are institutions that are either trying to reinforce or exploit these other institutions, which means you're really having to look at kind of the local set of vulnerabilities and everything that are available. And so you'll get these interesting situations where, like in the realm of crypto, where we have, like, at the theoretical level, very solid, defense dominance, right? Keeping kind of quantum out of the way. So we've got this weird situation where we have defense dominant technology, but a totally insecure cyberspace. And why is that? Well, it's because the institutional implementation, going all the way back to Bletchley Park, right, depends on people and institutions, and people are making mistakes and things are complicated, and people are not implementing their protocols the way that they should. So it's those frictions and complexities which end up determining the actual, offense-defense balance in practice. And, to the degree that there is, a valence towards kind of offense or defense in cyber, I think we need to recognize that defense has been getting much more robust as we've built up, this really lucrative private, global cybersecurity sector over the last 20 plus years, and governments have taken it a lot more seriously. So yes, there's still a lot of offensive activity, but that offensive activity has to get more sophisticated in order to stay in the game. So, it's this ongoing red creams race where everybody's, running to stay in the same place. But you definitely have, defense that has upped its game, creating more deterrence by denial, right? And forcing the other side to adapt accordingly.
Yeah, I appreciate especially that you framed it as a balance with the two, since although I'll also say that I think that there's a bit of a connective tissue between them. Sometimes balance feels like it's got to be like a trade-off, and we all know that like one can benefit the other, right? But like that just having one doesn't cost the other one necessarily. Where if you have a really good offensive posture, you're creating the operational space for defenses to take root. And in fact, that's part of how I feel around things like trying to dismantle, let's say, cyber criminal networks, why we needed this sustained pressure campaign on the offensive side, even though, yes, like basically the underlying cause for all this is we have a massive cybersecurity issue across this nation, but the levers of power that we have to do something about that, and the challenges of trying to scale that again across. We talked about democratic societies and issues where we have very fragmented authorities for things like regulation. The natural market incentives for maturization have not occurred at scale across all aspects of industry. Certain sectors like finance and the defense industrial base and even energy are certainly much more mature, but sectors like water, which are not giant money makers and do not have massive resources, they're supported by municipalities and local utilities. Like we have a very major challenge with some of these critical infrastructure sectors. And as Allan pointed out, this is one of the four that ultimately are being targeted by actors like Volt Typhoon. And while I've never heard the government characterize it this way, Rob Joyce spoke at some event where he was characterizing this as cyber terrorism. And I think that opens up a whole other door of academic discussions of terminologies, but where he was highlighting the potential impact of why you're pre-positioning for disruptive impact on water, communications, transportation, and energy is to sow societal panic. And so that has a massive implication in the long run. So I do think that in thinking about the balance, I will just say that right now, since we are dismantling and specifically telling the states and industry, hey, cybersecurity coordination is your problem, we're taking away a lot of funding and resources, diminishing the size of certainly cyber professionals across the US government. And then at the same time, Congress allowed for the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act liability protection to lapse, which was like literally the last line of defense for industry to be its own last line of defense, was this liability protection and safe harbor for industry to share cyber threat and defensive measure information with each other. While I agree with Jon that there has been an evolution and a sophistication of these amazing cybercrime firms that are doing great things, and I do think that they are leveraging already emerging technologies even better and more fast-paced, and that they're going to be a lot of the centers of gravity and partnerships with the choke points and the terrain advantages in the digital domain that the US has, and the fact that most of the companies that operate the digital infrastructure that illicit actors are often exploiting is American. So we have that. We have the negative in that, like, we have a thriving U.S. industry that makes for very attractive targets in a lot of ways, but then also the fact that the infrastructure and the terrain upon which they have to move through often is American. So it does create a good opportunity there. Obviously, I do think that disruption is important. We certainly have been doing offensive operations for a long time. So that is critically important, but that has to be done also in mind of what comes with a more fragmented defense that we currently have. And I do think, I hope that national coordination will be elevated and that we'll be able to bring to bear a lot of the capabilities that we've seen. And we've talked about some of the lessons that we can draw from, whether in deterrence and also prior warfare, to do greater real-time information sharing and disruptive action, as well as leveraging the benefits that we have. But we need to create operational space for those defensive measures to take root. They are not scaled sufficiently at all.
Just a super quick data and theory to support both Jon and Lindsay on that. One is just, you can look at the price of exploits and vulnerabilities over time, and it's gone up, right? If you want to break into an iPhone today, it's going to cost you $1 million at least, and that's wildly underpaying. It's worth a lot more on the open market. And the same is true for hacking into cars, right? Used to be the sort of thing that I could teach Jon or Carole how to, pop a 2008 or 2010 off the line vehicle and break into it. Brand new cars today, you actually need some serious expertise. On the theory side, Jon mentioned Red Queen hypothesis and the idea of running as fast as you can to stay in place. The optimal model now is you let the attackers move first, right? Because there's so much that I may have to defend. Let the attackers move first, And I have pre-invested in the ability to respond as quickly as possible. And that, as Carole mentioned, is information sharing and building out the support to make sure that institutions can get the data they need and actually turn that into intelligence and maybe even spend the money that they need to. That's not something that the private sector is amazing at, and we need at least more coordination to help the private sector move as quickly as possible.
Okay, we're coming towards the end here. I have one more question before we wrap up, which is just looking at the war in Ukraine, and really just recent years of cybersecurity. It seems to me, where we've been told in the past that what's coming are these big, heavy, disruptive attacks, acts of sabotage and warfare, even. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've seen much of that. Certainly not in Ukraine. So, are we sort of, back to the beginning, are we sort of looking at the wrong thing to the extent we're focused on these big attacks, or is it just uh, maybe a result of some success and that we've done a better job locking things down?
So, I mean, I think the Russians would have loved to have a big cyber boom in Ukraine if they could have, but they didn't because it's hard. The space is contested. Ukraine, with Western support, has really gotten much better in the last couple of years. Right? I remember this war started in 2014, and a lot of that was happening in cyber, and there was a lot of support. And so Ukrainians really upped their game. So it was a very contested environment. It was difficult for the Russians to act. And their cyber and intelligence forces were as discombobulated as the rest of the Russian military in 2022. So that's why I think, it's not just the strategic point. You got to look at the operational point. I think these are really, really difficult operations. When we talk about transitioning from peace to war in a domain where you're dependent on institutional stability to exploit, but war is happening in anarchy, like you are actively undoing the very conditions that allow you to operate, which is why, in the cyber warfare community, there's so much emphasis on operational prep of the battle space, because you want to do that before things really start to go haywire, and then you've got your Clausewitzian fog and friction that's messing you up. So I think lots of actors would like to have that, but it turned out to be really, really difficult. You watch the Russians go through several evolutions where now they've kind of settled back into, using this as a space for espionage and intelligence support to military operations. And that's why I love Allan's point about the advantages of being a second mover, right? Where you're in a space where you're going to start to see indicators of activity, and then you can start to flex your resources to that the same way that you might do with, your reserve forces in a traditional military campaign. And, once you buy that this is going to be kind of an operational thing and not a big boom where everything kind of melts down at once, then it relaxes the idea that you have to go first, or you have to prevent the other side from going to first. No, this is going to be a long-term interaction that you can kind of proactively shape and let the other side kind of tell you where you should be placing your bets. So again, I think we need to look at this as a long-term campaign that spans, peace and war, not this kind of nuclear framework of things are going to be really, really big.
I'll just jump in here and say, for Jon's point, we saw an example of what not to do, which is there was just no coordination between the cyber folks that were very specialized. They were an elite unit, and sort of Russia's war planning, which was, a dusted off 1970s Cold War manual that obviously didn't work. And I think as we have discussions in Washington about Cyberforce, that's going to be the key piece that we're going to want to discuss is having a separate cyber force going to enhance our ability to have these joint operations, and how do we include it in doctrine? The benefit of Cyberforce is it gives them more of a seat at the table to do that elite planning. The downside is maybe they're not as built in actual force planning.
Yeah, I don't know how much more I have to add on top of that, except that I agree that some of the initial thinking that was worried that cyber was going to be much more like a nuclear level of like catastrophic impacts, and that would be the way that it functioned, hasn't really proven out so far. But it has been like we have seen it. Like it's not that it's not existed, and ultimately that just like any other kind of munition or fires, like we have to think about the kinds of effects that they bring, and then ultimately what that impact is. And I do think that part of the inherent nature of just cyber does mean, and when Jon and Allan were both talking about Volt Typhoon pre-positioning earlier, like what does that do about shaping the nature of political will as and how the public is feeling back in the US and an area that is not generally like physically under danger in the conduct of warfare, at least so thinking about it from the US perspective, but then otherwise, just as Allan highlighted the sequencing. I will just add that I do think that cyber, to what extent that people feel that electronic warfare and jamming counts as cyber, I am really interested by like UAS and counter UAS strategy and doctrine is really developing in very cool ways right now. And I'm interested in seeing how like kinetic developments and capabilities, like seeing tons of founders focusing on that and seeing like high energy microwave and directed energy capabilities and lasers, but also with EW jamming, like to what extent that's going to be playing a role, and how that doctrine and those capabilities are going to be rapidly fielded as drone swarming strategy and other capabilities continue to develop. I'm really curious to see how those capabilities will intersect and sync with each other. So just from a tactical perspective, like really intrigued to see how those capabilities do interplay as that tech continues to evolve.
Okay, final question, which I want really brief answers to, criminally brief answers to, given the question. If you could make one organizational recommendation to the U.S. government on cybersecurity, what would it be in 30 seconds or less? So we'll go in reverse order. So Allan, you're on the spot, and Carole, then Jon, and then we're going to close.
That is a delightfully fun question. I think we need more transparency-driven tools, starting with reauthorizing the Cyber Information Sharing Act and pushing for better ways to help organizations communicate when they're doing the right thing, and nudge folks who haven't invested in good cybersecurity defense to up their game.
Carole.
I think elevating the role of national level coordination. I don't think critical infrastructure is being targeted because it's Texan or Georgian or anything. It's American, and focusing on the tools that Allan mentioned, but really leveraging, scaling those agencies' capabilities on coordination for real-time work with those choke points and the providers of like US and friendly infrastructure to do that deterrence by denial or disruption if the activity is already underway. I think that scaling those efforts, rather than like everyone's looking for a reorg right now, finding those things that were working or were good ideas and maybe not working to the scale that you want, but instead choosing to invest in that. I think that's critically what's needed right now.
Yeah. So I'm also very interested in the upstream coordination piece. I mean, I think that, a large proportion of the effort needs to be focused on shaping the environment. And that doesn't mean like operating in kind of the military sense. That means working with industry and developing the standards and developing, the informational relationships in order to create a healthier ecosystem, right? I mean, ultimately, we want to make the institutions more resilient and robust so that we can still have that, optimal amount, but small amount of cybercrime, but be able to detect when it gets a little bit bigger. So I think that it's the building in advance, which is really where our advantages are. And that means having smart industrial policies. And I can't talk about that in 30 seconds.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, all three of you, for doing this. And thanks, everyone, for watching.